the last part of this is to explore the services. Now, this is a graduate level course, so I definitely want to be exposing you guys to, end-tier architecture and, how it can be utilized. We're going to be talking about some tidbits along the way, so you might have, like points you want to write down that you have to read about more if you haven't seen some of these things in the past. And it might take a little bit of digging to get yourself up to speed. Don't feel that, that you're deficient somehow if you haven't, used object-oriented programming in these ways before. Like, this is why we're here, this is why we're learning it. So I like to establish a good tiered layout to my software, and this one is very small. I have a model and a service layer here. Normally I'd have at least a controller layer as well, and some additional pieces beyond that. But for right now, we're just kind of starting here. Now, what I want to show you is the layer that was below essentially what was our controller. It's like this one that we had here. I just didn't break it off, and it was this one kind of script that ran all from the main method. But it kind of, because we were running the command line, it kind of takes the place of what would be your controller, though, in a normal scene. And all of these things worked, like even up here where we were saving things like cars and drivers, because we kept calling on methods within these two files. And I said we'd come back to them, and now I want to do that, right? So I had a driver service and a car service. I'm going to start with the driver service because it's a little bit smaller and more straightforward. So the driver service had that ability to save a driver, right? We saw that up here. If we come back here, these first groups here, these were all where I created drivers, created the object, filled in the attributes, and ran save driver. What this was, and I can click on it and go right there. So remember, that's command click on a Mac, or should be control click, I think, on Windows. But if not, set it that way. It should be that way anyway. Then you get right here, right? So I passed in a driver, and this is a very simple function. I just wanted to show you that. So most of the work here, is actually being done by the library. I'm actually just wrapping it. I'm doing nothing more here than doing a null check to make sure that you didn't pass me nothing. And then I'm calling this .save, and you're like, wait, this is save. No, wait, it's save driver. What's this save? Well, here's the answer to that. My services, just like my model, extended the common state, which gave me those attributes that allowed for 4DFLib to save things through time and manage the IDs and all that. There's also a service layer that 4DFLib gives you that manages things like how to save and how to do queries off of things like ID and all those things that it already knows about. And those are available here. So you don't have to rewrite them yourself. In fact, all I did here by doing this at all, instead of just taking, of course, without this, but I could have used FDF common services directly back here, right? I could have come here and I could have said FDF common services .save, and then I would have had to pass it the class. So I could have said the class is driver dot class, and I would have had to pass it the driver's state, which is the actual thing I want to save. So in this case, it was Sam. And that's it. I think I would be done there. There was an overload. There was some other things to look at. But I could have just done this directly, right? And effectively, that's all that's happening here. I'm wrapping that call here. Now, just to do the null checking and also to, deal with this, because I didn't have to know to pass in the driver class here, because obviously this is the driver service. So if I'm saving a driver, then it's a driver class, and I know that, and I can wrap it here. Is it just more typing for nothing? Could I have just done this? Sure, I could have done this. I could have even null checked it here, right? But I just wanted to kind of really break that down and show you exactly what this is doing, right? So let's look here. I'm going to go into FDF Common Services. Now again, this is a class within 4DFLib that I'm extending. Let me make this bigger again so we can see it. And you can see that there's lots of documentation here, which is good, especially since this is the basic generic service that you're going to be using quite a lot. Let's see exactly what we did here, right? So we use specifically this save. So let's go right to that one. And this is the one, right? We passed in the entity state and the state itself. So the class and the thing. And this one, of course, calls an overload. What's happening here is, remember before I told you you didn't have to worry about these things? Well, that's because this is taking care of them for you. These were those overloads that I mentioned, like when I was typing it out in the last file and I said, oh, those are overloads, I don't have to worry about them. So if you're not managing, different systems, if this controller didn't care that it wasn't the default system that it was going to save it as in the default tenant, I could have passed that information in, right? But if I don't, it just uses the defaults. So that's what this stuff is, and you don't have to worry about it. It's just basically going to use what was saved in the state, the end user ID, the system ID, and the tenant ID that was in this state. And if you didn't set it, don't worry. It had those defaults from when you created it. If you remember back when we talked about the common state, it had that constructor that we called with super, and it set these things to default values, right? So if those default values are fine for you, and I think they will be, although you might be using your tenant ID here, then you don't have to think about this, right? You can just use these two things and be done. And then what's it do here? It goes to this save, right? So let's look at what's happening. Let's dig a little bit deeper here, right? Let's see how this works. So this is a little bit more of an actual method, right? There's actually things happening here. The first thing it's doing is it's getting the start time, and the start time for this new record we're going to create happens to be the current time. Go figure, right? And the state for the end date is going to be null, right? The current flag is going to be set to true. We're going to set that user ID, system ID, and tenant ID that we just talked about that we passed in, right? And then we're going to check to see if an ID has been assigned. Now, if you remember the state itself, so the state, remember, is the object here. And if I go back to driver, remember there's no ID. The ID existed here, right? So if I control click here, what we're referring to is this. Basically what happens is if the ID hasn't been set, this is a new record, because if it had existed in the database prior, when I queried for it, the state would have been filled in, right? It would have said, like if I had done one of those queries where like I got the car by year or got the car by project name, I would have gotten an ID back with it. If it finds the ID here, then it knows that this is not, like a new entity, and it will update it and do everything it needs to. If this is a new ID, meaning that there's nothing here, then it's basically going to deal with that. It's going to create it as a new entity and go forward now. Then the next thing it does is create all the audit records. So it's basically going to go through and it's going to say, okay, was there existing records, and do I have to, change their end dates to give them an end date and set their current flag to false and do all that. So it does all of that for you. This is where that magic happens. So you don't have to think about this. You don't have to rewrite this code ever, right? All you're ever doing is using it. So I'm not going to go through every single line. I invite you to, dig a little deeper with it if you want to. This, by the way, is the magic of reflection, that because I'm using a generic version of a class that is a superclass and saying that I expect you to give me a type of this superclass, then I can be generic. And if you pass me a class, if you pass me a driver or a car, it doesn't matter, right? So long as you pass me the thing and tell me what it is, which is why, remember back here, we set this driver.class. This is how I tell it what the class is it's working with. Then it can go ahead and do all that magic. So if you have never touched reflection, I invite you to look into it more. That's, as I mentioned earlier in the the week. It's definitely a more advanced topic, especially in object-oriented programming, but one that is well worth learning and enables you to do really cool stuff like this. So there's a bunch more calls to other methods that are in themselves could probably have like 40-minute videos about them, so I'm not going to go crazy there. I just wanted to give you a taste of what that looks like. So that was the save, right? That's very straightforward. As long as everything goes well, I return the driver back. So when you call this save driver, let's go to here. When you call this, I could have done this. I could have said driver my driver saved equals, and this has to have an R, and there you go. I could have had it passed back to me. Now why I'd want that, because I have Sam. Well, one thing that's important is Sam didn't have an ID if it was new, right? And now my driver saved will have an ID. So there is actually a case for that. In fact, you could do it this way. This might not be a bad convention where you say Sam equals that, because now if I don't requery for Sam, this Sam is going to have the ID, right? 4DFLib will still actually use other constraints that you have that are unique to try to ensure that it doesn't create two of the same record, and in fact, creates historical records instead. But that's a good convention nonetheless. All right, so that was the save. Let's look at the rest of what's going on here in driver. This one's pretty straightforward. So we also have a get driver by ID. You pass in an ID. And very similarly, it uses this get driver with history by ID. Now notice here that this again is something that we're actually calling. It's another method that we have. So we're calling from here to here. The reason why we're doing this is because I told you there's getting stuff with and without history. Getting it with history means that we have this FDF entity, right, with the type that we pass in. Getting it without history means that we're only looking at the current record. And because that's the case, all we care about is the class, right? So what this is doing is basically just getting it with history. It's calling this. But when it comes back, we're just returning that .current, right? We're just returning that current record, because the rest of it, we don't care. So the meat and potatoes of what's happening here is all here, right? So get history by ID, and that basically creates a driver as an FDF entity. And then as long as we have an ID that was passed in here that's valid, so we just check that, then we call this get entity by ID. Now again, because FDFLib gives you these attributes like RID and ID and current flag and all that, all of the methods that you would need to use those are given to you as well. So if we command click in on this, you can see yet again that we have a get entity by ID, and it also calls another one. So let's go in there. This one calls this manage entity. I'm not going to dig too much deeper. We could probably go down like 8 rabbit holes here. But it's going to do all of this for you, and it's using these more elaborate SQL statement builds that we'll talk about later when we get into the custom query. But that's not super important. What is important is that if you want to use one of those common state stuff, if you want to use services that revolve around these, they are provided for you. So something as simple as get X being whatever class that you're using right now by ID, you've got it already. You don't have to recreate the wheel. So driver service here, get driver with history by ID. All I really have to do is call this and pass in the class. So again, all I'm really doing, I could have done this in the other file and passed in the class and the ID, right? And that's it. And all I'm doing here is passing in the ID, and I know because this is the driver service, this is driver.class. It's then going to give me back a driver, which I'm going to return. And this, again, is the same as this. This just adds the .current on what came back from here. So what comes back from here is this. And then because this was an FDF entity, which is here, I'm calling .current on it to return only the driver. And that's all that is there. Now, The car service is a little bit more involved. So I'm not going to go through save car. That's the same as save driver, just for a car. You can see here the same rules apply. I just have this car.class. There's one thing to point out. Remember I said you can take and you can make things unique that are attributes outside of like ID. So we have an example of that here. We want to make cars by name unique. So overriding the generic save, right? This thing here, overriding it so you can have save car can do more than just abstract away the need to pass in the class. It can also give you an opportunity to say, well, I want a constraint to be unique on name, so I'm going to check for that in my code. So basically what I'm doing here is I'm saying, first I'm querying for cars here. So if we go here, that's down here. I probably should have just clicked on it. Here it is, get cars by name. And it's actually going to look for cars with the name that I pulled in. If there are any, it's going to return them. If it's not null, then the match is found. So I set this car's ID that I've passed in to be the same as that car. So I'm ensuring that I've put a unique constraint on the name of the car. So the name of the car is now unique, as is the ID, right? So this is another opportunity for you to do things like that. The rest of this is the same. I call save, passing car.class instead of driver, and save the car. This is also the same. So I have get cars by ID. I also have a get car with history by ID, which again is these two are the same, but this one is calling this one and using .current to only provide the current from the FDF entity. Then I have get cars by name with history, so that's just getting them by name. Notice here that I have this interesting method here. I happen to love this one a lot. So this is a 4DF entity, 4DF method that allows you to say, I want to query by one of my custom fields, meaning not the ones in common state. And to do that, I'm literally going to tell you what the class is, what the attribute is, and what the value is. And it's going to do the magic for you. So when I want to create a query by name, this isn't one of the common state ones, right? So there is no FDF method for, get my entity by name, because FDF didn't guarantee that there would be a name attribute. This is something I added. So in order to query by one of my fields, like make, model, year, all of these things that I added for name, right, that I added for car, this is how I can do that. It's one of the ways. I would argue, I think it's the better way. It's the cleaner way for sure. And because this is with history, what I expect it to pass back is a list of FDF entities, because they include history, and that's going to be cars with history, right? So this is what I expect this thing to return. We can take a quick peek here at what's going on, but again, it's going to be a little bit of a soup of getting to the right place, and here we are. So it's actually creating a custom where clause. We're going to look at that ourselves in a moment, where it's actually building out. This is what I was referring to. Remember when we talked before and I said it can be more code sometimes? Like if you were to just write this in SQL, you'd be like, select star from blah, 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 where name equals blah, 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 right? Pretty straightforward. To translate that into this is a lot of work, right? But what happens is, for all this work, we actually get to a place where we can do this. Where did I go? Car service here. And this isn't all that bad, right? It's object oriented. It makes sense. It's clean. It's simple. I love it. I guess that's why, yeah, it's just great. So that's all there is to it. And, now I get this list of FDF entities back. And if I want to return a particular one, I can get the first one, right? So I can do that, by the way, because the reason why is, let me back up on why this is just returning one and not the list, is because I set here in the save that name was a unique constraint, right? So I know there will only ever be one of these things. Any attribute that's not defined as a constraint is going to return a list, right? Because it should, because you hypothetically should be able to have more than one of them. But since I defined here that name is not one of those things, I can safely do this. I can say, in the case of name, I know I only expect to care about the one that comes back because there's only going to be one. So rather than return the list, I'm going to get the first one, and then I'm going to return just that entity, right? That's what's happening there. And then I also have get cars by name. This is similar to the pattern you saw before, where I'm going to call this, and then I'm going to get the current. Now, it's good habit to check that the thing you get back is not null, and that the current within the thing, remember this is an object within FDF entity, that this is not null. And under those two circumstances, then you can return the current value, right? So that would give me just a car. Then we have get cars by year with history. Same idea, but instead of doing the name, we're doing the year. So it's just another great example of how to do that. So this is probably going to be a common paradigm for you guys, because you are going to need to query your own information by your custom names, right? So this is going to be very important as you go through this project. Then I also have get cars by year again without history. Same exact idea. I get the whole thing, but this time I have to be cognizant that there actually could be a list of cars. Notice here this is a list of cars. Year is not a unique constraint. You can have multiple cars in the database from the same year, and we did, right? So this returns a list of FDF entity cars. This then has to iterate through that list, and for each one, check that there's a current. And then if there is, I add it to a cars that I intend to return that's just a list of cars. So this is basically just ripping the history out of this, just like we did before, but now we have a list and we can't just do it for the one object, right? Now this is the last one I'm going to touch on. This is another kind of unique way. Like if you want to dig a little bit deeper and play, I don't honestly know why you would have to, because I think this should take care of, I'm 99% sure this will take care of every use case you probably need, but there is a chance it will not. And I wanted to just kind of throw up this custom car query as an example of how we can dig deeper. So if you want to learn more about this, we can go directly to the SQL statement, but I can actually get there right here, so I'm going to do that. So command click. Let's make this bigger. The way this works, this was actually contributed by Corley, who has been at Maris for a while, and he's worked on different things with me, and he is currently a student. So if you see him, thank him for his contribution. And what this thing does is allow you to basically build any SQL statement in a more raw form using 4DFLib. So you can build the select, you can build the where, so you have selection, you have projection, you can do your group by in here, your order by, your limits, all of it, right? So I'm not going to get too dicey with this. You can play around with it. And if you have any questions, you can ask Corley. No, I'm kidding. But that joke aside, but if you want more control, you have a way to do it, right? And actually, if you dig through 4DFLib, you might have noticed earlier that a lot of it is actually using this to actually create your queries. So this is just a way that you can create them yourself. So if you have some crazy needs to do grouping and ordering and limits and that kind of stuff, it is here, and you can do it. That said, I really think if you use it the way it's intended to be used, you won't have to dive down that rabbit hole, right? I just wanted you to see it. This is one is simple. It's just using a where clause to do the same exact thing we did with name, just kind of manually, and then it builds the SQL statement, adding the where clause. If you wanted a select, for example, you could also add that here, or whatever other pieces it was, right? So you build this up, and there's plenty of examples of that in the library itself as well. And then this function is how it actually creates the FDF entity. I'm not going to dive deep into that. Again, it's just one of those encapsulated things that is built for you, so you don't have to think about it. And this function allows that to happen. So that's it for the demo. I hope this was very helpful. You should be able to use this example to really get you started on your own. And we'll go through the requirements specifically of the project in another video. But all of the project's requirements can be accomplished using the methods that we've been looking at. And I expect the project's output to mirror the type of output that we had here. This is exactly what I'm looking for, right? So you're going to have to create all this data and show me. You're gonna have to update, like change some of the data, or show. Really, it's more about showing the relationships between the data. I'm not, going too deep into the temporal part. We will have a discussion on that in, I think, a couple weeks, as part of the course. But at that point, we're halfway through the project anyway, and it's an important topic, but it's not the focus. The focus is on databases and applications and how they mix, and understanding relationships and understanding how to use a relational data model within an object-oriented model and make all that work. So it's a very, it's a pretty complex topic. I hope that you get a lot out of this. I hope that this is a good experience. Please ask questions first in the forums again, because it gives me the opportunity to answer them for everyone. And if you need something and it's pressing, you can always email me too and say, hey, check the forums. I've made this post. I try to be good, but just in case something, I don't want it to get stale, that kind of thing. So with all that said, I will see you in our next video.